A lone rider appeared on the horizon as the summer sun cast long shadows across the vast prairie of Wyoming Territory in 1875. Sarah Montgomery clutched her father's old rifle tighter against her chest as she watched the approaching figure from the porch of her small homestead. 6 months alone had taught her caution, especially toward strangers on horseback. The wind whipped her honey-brown hair across her face as she squinted to make out the rider. He was tall in the saddle, moving with the easy rhythm of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. As he drew closer, she could see he wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "That's far enough," Sarah called out when he was within earshot, raising the rifle to her shoulder. "State your business." The rider pulled his horse to a stop, raising both hands slowly to show he meant no harm. "Just passing through, madam, looking for work if there's any to be had." Sarah kept the rifle steady. "There's nothing here for you. Nearest ranch that might be hiring is 30 miles east." The man nodded respectfully, but didn't turn to leave. Instead, he glanced at the broken fence posts on the western edge of her property, the unplowed field beyond the house, and the leaning barn door that needed fixing. "Looks like you could use an extra pair of hands around here," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "I'm handy with tools, good with livestock." "I manage just fine on my own," Sarah replied, though the strain in her voice betrayed her. The stranger's eyes, a startling blue against his sun-bronzed face, surveyed the homestead once more. "Name's Preston Wade. I'm not looking for charity, madam, just honest work for fair pay." Sarah hesitated. The spring planting was already behind schedule, and the fence needed mending before predators got to her few remaining chickens. Her husband James had been dead 18 months now, taken by fever, and the neighboring homesteaders had gradually stopped coming by to help. "I can't pay much," she finally said, lowering the rifle slightly. Preston dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years under the open sky. "I don't need much," he replied. "A meal and a place to sleep would be fine to start." Sarah gestured toward the barn. "You can put your horse in there. There's a small room at the back where the ranch hand used to stay." She paused. "But I'll be keeping this close," she added, patting the rifle. Preston nodded, understanding her caution. "Yes, madam. And don't call me madam, my name is Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated, touching the brim of his hat. That evening, Sarah watched Preston from the kitchen window as he split wood with efficient, powerful strokes. There was something methodical about him, something reliable that she hadn't seen in a man since James. Still, she placed her father's revolver beside her plate when she called him in for supper. The meal was simple beans, cornbread, and coffee, but Preston ate with genuine appreciation. They spoke little, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware and the occasional crackle from the wood stove. "Why here?" Sarah finally asked. "There's plenty of ranches that could use a good hand, ones that could pay proper wages." Preston considered her question, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I've had my fill of big outfits, too many men, too many rules." He looked around the modest cabin. "Sometimes smaller is better, quieter." "It's certainly quiet," Sarah said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Too quiet some nights." Preston nodded but didn't pry further. After dinner, he insisted on washing the dishes, his large hands surprisingly gentle with her mother's china. "I'll start on that fence tomorrow," he said, drying the last plate. "Looks like you've got wolves coming too close to the house." Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you know about the wolves?" "Saw tracks by the chicken coop, fresh ones." She nodded, impressed despite herself. "They took 2 hens last week." "They won't take any more," Preston said, with such quiet confidence that Sarah almost believed him. Later, as she prepared for bed, Sarah glanced out the window to see Preston sitting on the porch steps, a rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the homestead. Something inside her, something that had been coiled tight for 18 long months, loosened just a fraction. The next morning, Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and found breakfast waiting on the stove, biscuits and bacon, while Preston was already at work on the fence. By midday, he had repaired the entire western section and was digging post holes for the north line. "You didn't have to cook," Sarah said, bringing him water and leftover biscuits. Preston wiped sweat from his brow. "My ma taught all her boys to cook, said no man should expect a woman to do everything." "How many brothers do you have?" "Had 4. 2 died at Shiloh, 1 in a mining accident near Denver." A shadow crossed his face. "Last one's ranching in Texas, last I heard." Sarah nodded, recognizing the look of loss. She'd seen it in her own mirror too many times. "The war took a lot of good men." "Yes, Madam Sarah," he corrected himself. "It surely did." Over the next week, Preston transformed the neglected homestead. The barn door no longer leaned, the chicken coop was reinforced against predators, and the spring planting was underway. Each evening, he would clean up and join Sarah for dinner, their conversations gradually lengthening as her suspicions slowly gave way to curiosity. She learned he had fought for the Union, though he spoke little of the war. He drifted afterward, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, mining in Colorado, even serving briefly as a deputy in a Kansas town before moving on. "You don't stay in one place long," Sarah observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. Preston's fingers absently traced a scar that ran along his jawline. Never found a reason to. On the 10th day, disaster struck. Sarah was gathering eggs when she heard Preston's shout from the field. She ran toward him, heart pounding, to find him holding the reins of her old plow horse, Samson, who was favoring his right foreleg badly. "Stepped in a gopher hole," Preston explained grimly. "Felt something go." Together they led the limping horse back to the barn. Preston examined the leg with gentle, knowing hands while Sarah held a lantern. "It's not broken," he finally said, "but he's strained it bad. He won't be pulling a plow for at least a month, maybe more." Sarah turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Without Samson, there would be no crop. Without a crop, there would be no food for winter, no seed for next year, no money to pay taxes on the land. "We can get the field planted," Preston said, reading her thoughts. "I can pull the plow." She turned back to him, eyes wide. "That's madness. No man can do the work of a horse." "Maybe not a city man," he replied with a slight smile, "but I've broken tougher ground than yours with just my back and determination." True to his word, the next morning Preston fashioned a harness from spare leather and rope. Sarah watched in disbelief as he hitched himself to the plow and began to pull, muscles straining against the resistant earth. She followed behind, guiding the blade as it cut through the soil. By midday, his shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands blistered. Sarah insisted they stop. "You'll kill yourself at this rate," she said, handing him water. Preston drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with his forearm. "Your husband, he planted this field alone," Sarah nodded. "James was stubborn that way, wouldn't ask for help even when he needed it." "Sounds like someone else I'm getting to know," Preston said with a gentle smile that caught Sarah off guard. That evening, as Sarah tended to Preston's blistered hands with salve, she found herself studying his face, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes, the week-old beard that softened his jawline, the way his eyes seemed to hold something both sad and hopeful. "Why are you helping me like this?" she asked suddenly. "You could find easier work, better pay." Preston was quiet for a long moment. "When I rode up, I saw more than a homestead needing work, Sarah. I saw someone fighting alone when they shouldn't have to." "I'm used to being alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been just me since James died." "Being alone and being lonely aren't the same thing," Preston replied. "I've been both." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. The next morning, as they prepared to return to the field, a wagon appeared on the road. Sarah recognized Mrs. Abernathy, the postmaster's wife from the small town 20 miles away. "Sarah Montgomery," the older woman called, waving frantically. "Thank the Lord you're all right." "We haven't seen you in town for so long." Henry was worried sick. Sarah welcomed her visitor, introducing Preston simply as her new hand. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled with obvious curiosity as she took in the tall cowboy. "Well now, that's fortunate," she said. "A woman alone out here, it isn't right, isn't safe," she lowered her voice. "There's been talk of the Barton gang moving through these parts. 3 men, all dangerous, robbed the bank in Clearwater 2 weeks past." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm spring day. The Bartons were notorious 3 brothers who had turned to outlawry after the war, leaving a trail of violence across 3 territories. Mrs. Abernathy didn't stay long, but she left behind mail, news from town, and a palpable tension. That night, Sarah found it hard to sleep, her mind filled with thoughts of outlaws and danger. When she heard a floorboard creak, she grabbed her revolver and crept to the window. Outside, Preston was making a slow circuit of the homestead, rifle in hand. The moonlight silvered his profile as he paused, listening to the night sounds, alert to any danger that might threaten them. Something about his vigilance, his quiet protection, made Sarah's heart beat faster. The next day brought a welcome surprise. The Wilkins brothers, whose farm lay 5 miles south, arrived with their team of horses. "Heard from Mrs. Abernathy you might be needing some help with planting," Frank Wilkins said, nodding to Sarah. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Preston. "This your new hand?" "This is Preston Wade," Sarah replied. "He's been a godsend." The older Wilkins brother, George, studied Preston. "Wade, that name's familiar. You rode with the Texas Rangers at one time," Preston nodded cautiously. "For a spell after the war." The brothers exchanged glances. "Heard tell of a ranger named Wade who tracked down the McCluskey brothers after they massacred that family near Austin." Preston's face remained impassive. That was a long time ago. With the Wilkins team, the plowing was completed in 2 days. Sarah insisted on feeding the brothers dinner both evenings, and the homestead rang with conversation and even laughter sounds that had been absent for too long. After they left, Preston seemed withdrawn. That night, as they sat by the fire, Sarah finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Were you really a Texas Ranger?" Preston stared into the flames. "For 3 years, joined up thinking I could do some good." He fell silent for so long Sarah thought he wouldn't continue. "Found out it's not always clear who the good men are. What happened with the McCluskeys?" His jaw tightened. "They killed a settler family, mother, father, 3 children. The youngest was just 4. His voice grew rough. "I tracked them for 2 weeks when I found them." He shook his head. "Let's just say I didn't bring them in for trial." Sarah studied his profile, seeing not a killer but a man carrying a heavy burden of justice and regret. "Is that why you left the Rangers?" "Partly. Started seeing too much gray where before I'd only seen black and white." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "What about you? How'd you end up out here alone?" Sarah told him about meeting James in St. Louis, where she'd been working as a schoolteacher. How his dreams of land and a home of their own had become her dreams too. Their journey west, the hardships of those first years, the gradual realization that the fertile valley James had envisioned was actually marginal land that yielded barely enough to survive. "When the fever took him," she said, her voice steady despite the pain the memories still brought, "I could have gone back east. My sister in Boston wrote, offering me a place, but this land," she gestured to the window, beyond which lay the acres they'd worked so hard to tame. "This became part of me, I couldn't leave it." Preston nodded, understanding. "Land gets in your blood." The next morning, Sarah noticed Preston watching the horizon, a furrow between his brows. "What is it?" she asked. "Storm coming," he replied. "Big one from the look of those clouds." By midday, the sky had darkened to an ominous green-gray. Wind whipped across the prairie, bending the new wheat shoots. Preston worked frantically to secure the livestock and equipment, while Sarah battened down the cabin. The storm hit with savage force just before dusk. Rain lashed the homestead in blinding sheets while thunder crashed overhead. Sarah and Preston huddled in the cabin, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. "The roof's leaking," Sarah said, pointing to water dripping near the fireplace. Preston was about to respond when a tremendous crash shook the cabin. They rushed to the window to see the barn's roof partially collapsed, one corner completely caved in. "The animals," Sarah cried. Without hesitation, Preston grabbed his coat. "Stay here." "I'm coming with you," Sarah insisted, already pulling on her boots. Together they battled through the storm to the barn. Inside, they found the horses panicked but unharmed in their stalls, though water poured through the damaged roof. Working side by side, they calmed the animals and moved them to the undamaged section. As they worked to salvage what they could, a sudden gust tore away more of the roof. A heavy beam swung down, heading straight for Sarah. Preston lunged, knocking her aside, taking the blow across his shoulder. Sarah screamed as he went down. For one terrible moment, she thought he was dead, then he groaned, trying to push himself up. "Don't move," she ordered, kneeling beside him. In the dim lantern light, she assessed his injury. His shoulder was badly bruised, possibly dislocated, but no bones appeared broken. With Sarah's help, Preston staggered back to the cabin. She eased him onto her bed, the only dry place in the house, and carefully removed his shirt to examine the injury. "It needs to be set," she said, recognizing the dislocated shoulder from when James had suffered the same injury. Preston nodded grimly. "Do it." Sarah positioned herself, remembering how the doctor had shown her. "This will hurt." "I trust you," Preston said, his eyes holding her steadily. With a quick, firm movement, she pushed the joint back into place. Preston's face went white, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. "There," Sarah said, her hands gentle as she bandaged his shoulder. "You'll be sore for days, but it should heal clean." The storm raged on through the night. With the roof leaking in several places, they were confined to the small bedroom. Sarah insisted Preston take the bed while she made a pallet on the floor. "This isn't right," Preston protested. "I should be the one on the floor, with that shoulder." "Don't be foolish," Sarah replied. "Besides, it's my house, my rules." Despite her practical tone, Sarah found herself acutely aware of Preston's presence a few feet away. The intimacy of the situation, sharing a bedroom, having touched his bare skin as she tended his wound, awakened feelings she'd thought long buried. Unable to sleep, she stared into the darkness, listening to the rain and Preston's steady breathing. After a while, she realized he was awake too. "Sarah," he said softly. "Yes, thank you, not just for the shoulder, for everything." His simple words pierced something inside her. "I should be thanking you," she whispered. "You've done so much." "We've helped each other," Preston replied. "That's what matters." By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Fields that had been dusty were now muddy, the creek had overflowed its banks, and the barn stood partially destroyed. They surveyed the damage in the clear light of dawn. Preston's face was grim as he examined the barn. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said finally. "The frame is still sound. We can rebuild the roof." "We?" Sarah asked, the word catching in her throat. Preston met her gaze. "If you'll have me stay." Something warm unfurled in Sarah's chest. "I'd like that." Over the next days, as Preston's shoulder healed, Sarah found herself watching him when he wasn't looking the way his hands moved with such sureness, the quiet competence he brought to every task, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. He was unlike any man she'd known, including James. Where her husband had been enthusiastic and sometimes reckless, Preston was measured, thoughtful, his strength contained until needed. Word of the storm damage spread, and neighbors Sarah hadn't seen in months came to help rebuild the barn. The Wilkins brothers returned with lumber. Mrs. Abernathy organized the women from town to bring food. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his homestead, arrived with his tools and decades of carpentry experience. Sarah was overwhelmed by the community's response. "I didn't think anyone remembered we were out here," she confessed to Preston as they watched a dozen people working on the barn. "People remember," Preston said. "Sometimes they just need reminding." She glanced at him, suspecting he'd had something to do with the sudden outpouring of neighborly support, but his expression revealed nothing. That evening, with the barn roof nearly complete and the neighbors gone, Sarah and Preston sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass. The air was sweet with the scent of wild roses that grew along the fence line. "I've been thinking," Preston said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Your wheat crop will come in good with all this rain, but you could do better with cattle. This land would support a small herd." "I wouldn't know the first thing about raising cattle," Sarah admitted. "I would." Preston turned to face her. I've been saving to start my own spread someday. I've got enough for a decent starter herd, maybe 20 head. Sarah stared at him. Are you proposing a business arrangement? I'm proposing. Preston hesitated, then continued more carefully. I'm suggesting we might accomplish more together than apart. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart quicken, but uncertainty held her back. Preston, I don't know what you're asking. Preston's eyes held her steadily. I'm asking to stay, Sarah, not just as your hand, as your partner, in all ways. Sarah looked away, overwhelmed. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to think of a future that included someone else. I need time, she whispered. Time is something I can give, Preston replied gently. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw the rider approaching a tall man in a black coat, his horse a sleek chestnut. As he drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Daniels from the county seat. Preston emerged from the barn, instantly alert. He moved to stand near Sarah, his posture protective without being obvious. Mrs. Montgomery, the sheriff nodded as he dismounted. His eyes shifted to Preston. And you must be Wade. Sheriff, Preston acknowledged, his voice neutral. What brings you out this way? Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the tension she could feel emanating from Preston. Been tracking the Barton gang, Daniels replied. They hit a stagecoach 2 days ago near the territorial line. Driver said they were heading this direction. His gaze returned to Preston. Word is you used to wear a badge, Wade. Preston nodded once. Texas Rangers, long time back. Well, I could use an experienced man. I'm deputizing every able hand I can find. These Bartons are desperate men. Sarah felt cold fear slide down her spine. Surely they wouldn't come all the way out here, she said. There's nothing worth stealing. Sheriff Daniels shook his head. They're not just after money anymore. Word is the youngest Barton took a bullet in that stage robbery. They'll be looking for a place to hole up while he heals. Isolated homestead would suit them fine. After the sheriff left, having extracted Preston's promise to keep watch and send word if he saw anything suspicious, Sarah couldn't shake her dread. The idea of violent men invading her home, the home she'd built with James, the home she and Preston were slowly bringing back to life, filled her with both fear and fury. Maybe I should go into town until this passes, she said that evening as they ate dinner. Preston considered this. Might be safer, but that would leave the place undefended. You'd stay, someone has to. His eyes met hers across the table, but I'd rest easier knowing you were safe. Sarah straightened her shoulders. This is my home, Preston. I won't be driven from it by fear. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Didn't think you would. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind sounded like approaching danger. When she heard footsteps on the porch, she grabbed her revolver and crept to the window. It was only Preston, making one of his regular checks around the property. In the moonlight, she could see the rifle in his hands, the alertness in his posture. He paused, looking out toward the road, and in that moment, Sarah realized something fundamental had shifted within her. She was no longer alone against the world. Somehow, in the weeks since Preston Wade had ridden up to her homestead, he had become essential to her life in a way she hadn't thought possible again. The next day passed in tense watchfulness. Preston taught Sarah how to use his rifle, which had better range than her father's old gun. They established signals and made plans for various scenarios. The practical activity helped calm Sarah's nerves, but every distant sound made her jump. As dusk approached, Preston grew increasingly vigilant. I don't like this, he said, scanning the horizon. If they're coming, it will be soon. Sarah stood beside him on the porch, her own rifle ready. How can you be sure? Years of tracking men like them. They'll come at dusk or just after dark, less chance of being spotted from a distance. His prediction proved accurate. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, Preston suddenly stiffened, pointing toward a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile from the house. There, he whispered. 3 riders moving slow. Sarah squinted but could barely make out the shadows he'd spotted. How do you know it's them? No one rides like that unless they're trying not to be seen. Preston turned to her, his face grave. Sarah, I need you to do exactly as we planned. Get inside, bar the door, and stay away from the windows. And leave you out here alone. That wasn't the plan. Plans change, Preston said firmly. These men are killers, I won't risk you. Before she could protest further, he gently pushed her toward the door. Please, Sarah. I can't do what needs doing if I'm worried about you. Reluctantly, Sarah went inside, but she positioned herself near a window where she could see part of the yard, her rifle ready. Through the glass, she watched Preston disappear into the shadows of the barn. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The homestead lay silent under the emerging stars, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. Then came the soft thud of hooves on soil. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, approaching the cabin cautiously. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see they were hard men. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered with a bushy beard. Behind him rode a leaner man whose face was hidden by a bandana. The third slumped in his saddle, clearly injured. "Hello, the house," the bearded man called. "We're looking for help. My brother's been shot." Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger of her rifle. This was exactly what Sheriff Daniels had warned them about, the Bartons seeking shelter for their wounded member. The bearded man dismounted, approaching the porch. "Madam, we know someone's home. We can see the light. We don't mean no harm." Sarah remained silent, heart pounding. "Damn it, woman," the man's tone changed abruptly. "Open this door or we'll break it down. We need that wound tended and we need food and horses." The second man dismounted, drawing his pistol. "Let's just get this over with, Frank. Shoot the lock off." Sarah took aim at the bearded man's chest. Just as he raised his gun toward the door, a voice rang out from the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Barton." Preston stepped into view from behind the woodpile, his rifle trained on the outlaws. "Drop your weapons, both of you." The bearded man, Frank Barton, spun around, his gun now pointed at Preston. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Wade. Texas Rangers, once upon a time. Now I'm just the man who's going to see you hang for what you did to that family in Clearwater." Frank's face contorted with rage. "Ain't no ex-ranger taking me in." What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Frank fired at Preston, who dove aside, returning fire as he rolled. The second Barton brother lunged for cover behind a water trough, shooting wildly toward the house. Sarah couldn't see Preston anymore. Panic surged through her. Without thinking, she threw open the door and fired at the man behind the trough, forcing him to duck down. "Sarah, get back inside." Preston's voice came from somewhere near the barn. Frank Barton, hearing Preston's shout, swung his gun toward the house. Before he could fire, Preston emerged from the shadows and tackled him to the ground. The 2 men grappled fiercely, rolling in the dirt. The second Barton broke from cover, aiming at Preston's back. Sarah fired again, her bullet striking the outlaw in the shoulder. He staggered but remained standing, turning his gun toward her. A shot rang out, but not from the wounded Barton. The third man, the one they'd thought too injured to fight, had drawn a hidden pistol. Sarah felt a burning pain along her upper arm as his bullet grazed her. Preston, still wrestling with Frank Barton, saw Sarah hit. With a roar of fury, he slammed the outlaw's head against the ground, knocking him unconscious. In one fluid motion, he spun and fired at the wounded Barton, hitting him squarely in the chest. The second brother, clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked from his fallen sibling to Preston's unwavering rifle. Slowly, he dropped his gun. "Sarah," Preston rushed to where she stood swaying in the doorway. "How bad?" "Just a graze," she managed, though the pain was making her light-headed. "The youngest one?" "He's dead," Preston said grimly. "The other 2 won't be causing any more trouble." Using rope from the barn, Preston secured the surviving Bartons to the porch posts. The wounded one was losing blood but would survive until the sheriff could arrive. Frank Barton, now conscious but subdued, glared silently at them. Inside the cabin, Preston gently cleaned and bandaged Sarah's wound. His hands trembled slightly, the only sign of the emotion he was containing. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "When I saw you come through that door." "I couldn't stay inside while you were fighting them alone," Sarah replied. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." Preston's hands stilled on her arm, their eyes met, and all the unspoken feelings of the past weeks hung in the air between them. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words. She reached up with her good hand and touched his face. "I know," she whispered. The next morning, Sheriff Daniels arrived with 3 deputies. He surveyed the captured outlaws and the body of the youngest Barton with grim satisfaction. "You've done this county a service," he told Preston and Sarah. "There's a substantial reward for these men, dead or alive. It'll be paid to you once they're brought to justice." After the sheriff departed with his prisoners, the homestead seemed strangely quiet. Sarah found Preston in the barn, brushing down his horse with methodical strokes. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice catching despite her efforts to sound calm. Preston turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." Sarah took a deep breath. "When James died, I thought that part of my life was over. I convinced myself I was meant to be alone, that it was safer that way." She moved closer to him. "I was wrong." Preston set down the brush and closed the distance between them. Gently mindful of her injured arm, he took her hands in his. "I've wandered most of my life," he said quietly. "Never found a place that felt like home until I rode up to your door." "Is that why you stayed? Because you needed a home?" Preston shook his head. "I stayed because of you, Sarah." "Only you?" The reward money for the Barton gang arrived a month later. By then, the wheat was growing tall in the fields, and the small herd of cattle Preston had purchased was grazing contentedly in the north pasture. They stood together on the porch, looking out over their expanding homestead. The reward money would allow them to build a proper cattle barn before winter and hire help for the harvest. "I never thought I'd have this again," Sarah said, leaning against Preston's solid warmth. "A future worth planning for." Preston's arm tightened around her. "We're just getting started," he promised. That night, as a cool breeze drifted through the open window, Sarah lay beside Preston, her head resting on his chest. The rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear was the most comforting sound she'd ever known. "I'm used to sleeping alone," she whispered, tracing a pattern on his skin. Preston pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. "Not anymore," he said softly. "Not ever again." And as the moon rose over the Wyoming prairie, casting silver light across the land they now shared, Sarah knew he spoke the truth. The solitude that had defined her existence was gone, replaced by something far more precious, a love born of mutual respect and shared struggle. A partnership that would weather whatever storms the frontier might bring. In the years that followed, the Montgomery Wade ranch prospered. The small herd grew, the crops flourished, and in time, the sound of children's laughter joined the symphony of homestead life. A son came first, sturdy and serious like his father, with eyes that seemed to take in everything. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, with her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's quiet determination. Preston built a larger house as their family grew, but the original cabin remained standing, a reminder of where their story had begun. On summer evenings, they would often sit on the porch, watching their children play in the yard where once they had fought for their lives against the Barton gang. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked one such evening as their son showed his little sister how to lasso a fence post. "Settling down with me instead of continuing your adventures." Preston's laugh was low and warm. "What adventures? Sleeping rough, eating bad food, risking my neck for people who'd forget my name before I was out of sight." He took her hand, running his thumb over the gold band he'd placed there 7 years ago. "This is the adventure, Sarah. Every day with you and those 2 wild things out there, that's all the excitement I'll ever need." Neighbors would remark on the special bond between the former Texas Ranger and the stubborn widow, who had tamed both him and the unforgiving prairie. Those who knew them best understood that their strength came not just from love, but from the profound respect they held for each other's courage and resilience. And on those rare nights when storms would rage across the Wyoming Territory, lightning illuminating the vast landscape beyond their window, Sarah would remember that first storm they had weathered together. She would turn in Preston's arms, finding his eyes in the darkness, and whisper, "I'm glad I'm not alone anymore." His answer was always the same, a promise renewed with each passing year, "Not anymore, not ever."